I've had I've had decades of living with John Jones Llanrwst and his family. I first came across the products of the Llanrwst press in 1962, when I could barely speak Welsh. I was very interested in ballads. I had bought a couple of English broadside ballads, a booklet, which cost me 30 shillings, which was a lot of money in 1959, and a single-sided sheet, which cost me 7 and 6pence, which at that time would have bought you a slap-up dinner in a very good restaurant. And when I discovered that you could buy a Welsh ballad in the basement in Griff's bookshop in Cecil Court in London for 2pence, I thought, this is what I ought to be collecting. And I was able to buy half a dozen of those ballads, and 1 or 2 of which were the product of Llanrwst. I became more interested once I knew more about books. And in my 30s, which was a long time ago, I was arrogant enough to think that I could write the definitive book about Welsh books. Of course, it took at least a dozen people to write a really good book about the Welsh book, so I'm glad I didn't try. But in my efforts to find out what was going on in the early 70s, I discovered the tiny printing work of John Jones, the smallest books ever published in Welsh. And that led me to write a biography of John Jones, because a wonderful meeting with Eluned Rhys, my dear friend, who is, I'm glad to say, still in excellent health and a great help to me. She told me that she showed me the tiny books, and she told me about John Jones's account books and manuscripts in the National Library. So I did my best in out of school time to write a book about John Jones. And the result was that although I wasn't able to publish the full biography, I was able to persuade Myrddin ap Dafydd, who has inherited the printing heritage of Llanrwst through his press, Carreg Welch, and he published this little book, A Dyn ar Naeth Argraff, The Man Who Made an Impression. I gave a lecture about John Jones under that title in Welsh many years ago. And a dear lady came forward in the end and said to me in Welsh, I did enjoy that, but mind you, if I'd known it was going to be about a printer, I wouldn't have come. And I think that is the attitude that too many people have towards printers. They regard them as mechanics. Well, John Jones, as I hope to show, was far more than a mechanic. That's him. In his old age, he was well past 70 when that was taken. But I think it's a lovely, humane picture. It's the only one of his family of whom I have a picture, and I don't think that any others exist. He was not a pioneer in the sense that his grandfather, Dewi Jones, Dewi Fardd o Trefriw, had established a press in Trefriw in 1773, was it? 76, I can't remember offhand. And he did a great deal of printing until he was in his 80s. And he was using a famous press, the old wooden press, which Lewis Morris of Anglesey had set up first in Llanrwst and then in Holyhead. But all he'd managed to publish was a single issue of a journal he had hoped to create in 1730. And he only produced 1 number, and that was it. And eventually, after considerable trouble with the Morris brothers, because they encouraged Dewi Fardd, and then they started to tease him and pull his leg and insult him to his back and lie about the availability of the press, that it no longer existed. Well, it did exist. And he somehow got it from Holyhead all the way up the Conway River to Trefriw, where he printed for the rest of his life. He made an effort, as we'll see, but his son Ishmael, he inherited the press and kept on printing, but he was not a good printer. And things only changed when John Jones, his son, started printing in about 1811, and at once the appearance of his products improved, as we'll see. The generations continued. Robert Jones, his brother, one of several, of course, but he was a printer in Conway and Bangor, and his son Robert Griffith Jones also printed in Carnarvon, if I remember rightly. And Owen, who called himself Owen Jones Evans, inherited the press, but his father was very critical of him. He was bone idle, much preferred fishing, and he did. Although he kept the press going after a fashion, I suspect that it was his sister Catherine who did much of the work. Evan was also a printer. He set up a press in Porthmadog, and he was a great help to his father. And they used to swap pamphlets and lend each other workmen when they needed help. And sometimes they had to borrow money from each other. And sorry, I've gone too fast. Never mind. John was by training a blacksmith, and he spent time in Liverpool, and he came across a press designed by a Scotsman called Ruthven, and John Jones built several of these presses, one of which I saw in the Science Museum in South Ken years ago, because the last of the family, J.J. Lloyd, who died in 1935, at his death, he passed the whole inheritance, everything in the old printing office, went from Llanrwst to London. And eventually, sometime I think in the 60s, South Ken offered practically everything except the press to St. Fagan's Folk Museum. They had the idea of setting up a printing shop using all John Jones's stuff because there was so much of it. But I don't think that anything has ever happened. As far as I know, it's all still in store, which is an awful shame. There's another Ruthven press which went to St. Fagan's. That is in pieces. It's never been reassembled, but it could be if somebody had the interest to do so. John Jones was also a man who learned to cast his own type. You can see here his ladle for pouring metal. He used patrices and matrices, and he would fit the matrix into this little slot and pour the hot metal in. He's the only man ever to cast metal for printing in Wales. And of course, that is something that nobody does these days. So he'll remain a one-off, I'm quite sure. Oops. He also invented a guillotine, which the photograph was taken in South Kensington. I think that has moved as well to St. Fagan, although I'm not sure. Now, back to Dewi Vawr, he was a real literateur. He loved Welsh poetry. He wasn't very inspired himself, but he collected poetry on a vast scale. This was the second of volume of three that he published. This was done in Shropshire, and this is actually the second edition, 1779, which he oversaw, although he was well into his 70s doing that. The first edition was 20 years earlier, and he claimed that he'd lost £20 in the publishing, but he still kept going and brought out a new edition. And a third edition was published after his death. This is the first book that he published, two sermons by George Whitfield. I don't know who the translator was. Dear, oh dear. Sorry about this, I'm losing my way. He published ballads. You saw briefly one there, and here are two more. these are, now this is the only photograph which is taken from the National Library. This is a remarkable two poems, of course, two new songs. The second one is the story of the girl from Avoti in Monmouthshire who killed 7 brothers who tried to rape her. It's the most remarkable ballad. Nobody has ever sort of spotted it until I was able to persuade a current Welsh singer. Now, how do I click to get back? No, I'm going on, and that's not what I wanted to do. Not at all. I'm sorry about this.
Down to the bottom left corner.
Bottom left corner.
Then you can go back. Yes.
There we are. That's good. Thank you very much. You can see that this is quite a tidy work by Ishmael Davies's standard. Most of his stuff was much more like this, simply saying printed in Trefriw, or even nothing at all, although it's quite clear that this is a work from Trefriw. And as well as publishing ballads, Ishmael Davies, like his father, published pamphlets. This is an extraordinary story of Sawney Bean and a story of cannibalism in Scotland, an 8-page pamphlet printed in Trefriw. That's all Ishmael Davies bothered to say. He didn't have an ego. But in 1811, it's quite clear that John, his son, had taken over, and he started experimenting with typefaces and with ornaments, which his father had never bothered with. And although he was using his father's name, it's quite clear to me that everything from now on until Ishmael Davies died in 1817 was done at Trefriw by the son, John Jones. Now, the Llanrwst Press had a long association with the Dublin almanacs. These were not published in Dublin, although this is a number which claimed to be. The reason that they claimed to be published in Dublin was that there was a tax on periodicals, and they could avoid the tax by printing Dublin on the cover. And it was printed in Llanrwst, printed in Trefriw to begin with, then in Llanrwst. And it was only in the 1830s that the tax was done away with, and they could publish the almanac as of Llanrwst by 1830. And this is the only copy I have of a Llanrwst Dublin almanac. There are copies, of course, in the National Library, a whole runs of them, but they are much more difficult to find than ballads even. By 1815, John had become really ambitious, and this is a fine volume of music in praise of the Lord, a collection of the psalms and hymns, printed in 1815, with using engraved music, which must have been done in London. I don't know who provided the picture of John Ellis, the author. Perhaps Ridian will be able to tell us at the end, but this is a truly remarkable book. And I'm delighted that I was able to find a copy. I've never seen another one for sale. So it's very difficult to buy new Llanrwst stuff now, but there we are. I'm lucky to have all that I do have. One of the more remarkable feats that John achieved while he was still based in Trefriw was the publication, I say publication, the printing, somebody else must have done the publication, and I don't know who, of 3 books dealing with Welsh history. The first was a new edition of Drych Prifoesoedd, the Welsh classic by Theophilus Evans, originally printed in 1715 and popular throughout the 18th century, with the Gomeric and biblical descent of the Welsh, of course, believing that the Gymraeg was Gomeraig, corrupted, and so on and so forth. But it was an exciting book, especially as John Jones was able to commission this illustration by a man from Carnarvon called Cope, and this shows the the Night of the Long Knives, at which the British chieftains were invited by Vortigern and his treacherous Saxons to a feast. They arrived, stacked their knives and swords, and at the given signal, each Englishman attacked a Welshman and stabbed him to death. The original Night of the Long Knives, a title adopted, of course, when Harold Macmillan summarily dismissed a third of his cabinet. The second volume of this history is this one here, Prynhawn Gwaith y Cymru. This is the story of medieval Wales, the story of the princes by William Williams of Llanrwst, printed 2 years, I think, after the Theophilus Evans. So this is the second volume of the history of Wales. And here we have the nearest thing that there is to a third volume, Drych yr Amseroedd, by Robert Jones Rhoslan, a Methodist, a Calvinistic Methodist, who published the story of the faith in Gwynedd in particular, especially in the more recent times. So in a sense, you have 3 volumes covering, however crudely, the history of Wales. At the other end of the scale, so to speak, John Jones, by this time in Llanrwst, he moved in 1825, was printing all kinds of interesting ephemera. This is a printed alphabet and reading sheet to be printed on one side of the paper only, with the printer's colophon down the middle and ornaments around the text. And this was to be stuck on a piece of wood and used as a text for children to learn to read, and adults too, of course, because in the 1820s, the majority of the population was still semi or non-literate in their own language. This is a unique copy, as far as I know. Tim tells me that the National Library hasn't got it, and I have another one as well, a different one. Then you get all kinds of interesting stuff. Again, remember that John Jones is not the publisher; he is the printer. Other people, we don't often we don't know who commissions the book to be published. This is a famous work, the American, by Benjamin Chidlaw, a Welsh-speaking Welshman who emigrated to the States and published a book in Welsh about all the advantages. This was in 1840. This is a second edition. I've never seen the first edition. And over here we have a version of Culpeper's Herbal, Welsh text, even though it's got an English title at the top in small print. Back to music, and here we have a very interesting volume. The principles, now peroriaeth, of course, when you hear Welsh people speak about music today, they usually use the English word music. But there is a Welsh word, peroriaeth, the sweetest of sounds. And this is the principles of music. And it's got a very pleasant, well-designed, rather unusual shape cover, because of course it fits with the kind of text that he uses. And I believe I'm right in saying that this music type was cast by John Jones himself. It's not an engraved sheet. It's a hand-set printed sheet, and all the more remarkable for that. And John Jones also used this in several other publications, in a little book of carols, caroles, and occasionally on ballad sheets as well, because of course ballads were to be sung. This brings us to one of his most notorious publications. He wasn't the pioneer. The pioneer, of course, Gwaith Aristotle, the Secreta Secretorum of Aristotle, is a medieval Latin text, which Aristotle would be surprised to read if he could read Latin, because it was written sometime, we don't know by whom, in the Middle Ages, in Latin. It was translated into English and I've got an English version. And the first printer of the Welsh translation, again, we don't know who the translator was. The first printer was John Jones's brother, Robert. This was printed at the Canovium Press, the Conway Press in the town of Conway. But John Jones really went to town on his edition, which I think dates to about 1840. He's got about 22 different typefaces on this sheet, which I think is great fun and absolutely appalling at the same time. But he just couldn't resist it. The book has illustrations, of which this, and I realize that part of it is blotted out, but of course it attempts to show a pregnant woman's belly with the child in, with the fetus in situ. And there were all sorts of stories about this book, which go back to John Jones's time. It was said that if the maidservant was caught by her master with a copy of this book, she would be instantly fired. And one of the stories about Thomas Williams Capelillo, who was an itinerant bookseller for John Jones after he sobered up. He used to be teased by little boys who would run after him saying, sell us a copy of Gwaith Aristotle, Aristotle. They wanted Aristotle. And Thomas Williams, who had copies, no doubt, for sale, would turn on these children and shout at them, it's not Aristotle, it's Harrystotle, and you should get the name right. After that excitement, it's a bit more sobering to look at these. Here we have a book, a mirror of the water of the sick, the urine of the sick. This was how to diagnose illness by examining urine specimens. This is a pamphlet. It's an early pamphlet, later reprint. I see this is the Trefriw edition. It should be earlier than this presentation. This is the story of the life and death of Judas Iscariot. But over here, and I'm sorry it's such a mangled title page, it's actually in perfect condition except for the awful markings. But this is a very remarkable book, Formula Grustensis. It's an English book written by a man called John Williams, who writes in it a description of every living thing, every scientific phenomenon, such as the rocks, the bogs, the rivers, the gases in the air, everything in the parish of Llanrwst, Formula Grustensis, the creatures or the creations of the Grwst's parish, Llanrwst. And if you're lucky enough to find a copy of that, hang on to it. It's an absolute treasure. It's worth hundreds of pounds. Here I've put 3 of the tiny books. They're a series of 5 that John Jones published. I was lucky enough, absolutely lucky enough, years ago, to be given the set of 5 by a dear lady who had grown up in her childhood next door to the printing office of John Jones in Llanrwst, when it was still in the possession of J.J. Lloyd, John's great nephew. And he gave her a couple of sets of the book, and she gave me one of them. And I treat them with the greatest love and respect. The images that you see, well, what you're looking at is a penny, an ordinary modern penny, by comparison. That's almost the width of the printed section of the pages. And yet the type is as clear as can be. It's a series of little booklets of 16 pages each, which were given to children as Sunday school prizes. And you can imagine that that is enough of an explanation as to why they're so scarce. I've never seen any on sale, but I'm sure that they're pretty valuable for their unique quality. Nothing smaller has ever been attempted in Welsh. It would, of course, be perfectly possible, but nobody's done it. Then we have the history of the moon, discovered all the wonders supposedly discovered by Sir John Herschel through his telescope. Now, John Herschel, of course, you're talking about a real astronomer, a real family of astronomers, in fact. And according to the title page, he could see through his telescope, which magnified 42,000 times, all the living creatures that exist on the moon, including birds, rivers, plants, trees, houses, and winged human beings walking around. This also is the work of Cope, the man who illustrated the Night of the Long Knives earlier on, and we'll find his work again in a minute. Now, we reach the ballads. John Jones inherited the ballad publication tradition of his father and grandfather, but by this time, they were 4-page ballads rather than the 8-page ballads of the older period. John Jones liked to have woodcuts, metal or engravings when he could. This one, A Gwydir Glas, a popular song, is one of the tuppenny ballads that I bought in Griff's all those years ago. If I wanted a copy today and could find one, a bookseller today would ask me for a £5. Well, from tuppence to a £5, I suppose I've done pretty well, really, but now any editions still cost a £5. This is a New Year's, a Christmas carol, Plygain, the Christmas services that used to be so popular and are still popular and are being revived in, especially in Ceredigion, Carmarthenshire, and round Wales. A tradition which at one stage was only really flourishing in Montgomeryshire. 2 more ballads, and you'll recognize one of them, I'm sure, because that is how the words of Hen Lladron Hadau, the Welsh national anthem, became known to people. This must have been circulated by the 1,000, and along with an English translation, which never caught on. And this is, I loved the Bachgen Mine ballad. This is a rare one indeed. It's the only one I have that has a full-page cover illustration. But John Jones was also known for publishing large, what I call broadside ballads, balladi tablen fawr. They tended to be on Christian subjects. They were not unique to him. Another printer in Cardigan, Isaac Thomas, was producing the same kind of thing. And thanks to the good fortune of the National Library in its early days in having been given the contents of Isaac Thomas's printing office early in the 20th century, when nobody had any use for it in Cardigan, and a whole lot of his ballads and a whole lot of John Jones's broadside ballads survive. Very few by any other printer survive. That doesn't mean to say they don't exist. This one on the right, Profiad y Christian, the Christian's experience, with some of Cope's illustrations and some music with the John Jones music keys, I believe, and some interesting ornaments. And over here, the story of Elijah being fed by the ravens in the main picture. And this, an extraordinary piece, whipping in the militia, because this time militia soldiers who were called up for 2 years on a kind of home service basis could be treated just as other regular soldiers could be, by being lashed with the cat o' nine tails. And this was an attempt by the Peace Society. I'm sure they commissioned it and provided the illustration. I don't know who translated the verses into Welsh, but there we are. John Jones was a liberal in his time. He would print anything, but his own inclination was always to be on the liberal side of politics, which of course was common enough in Wales. Some more of his interesting and unusual publications. I had almost given up my attempts to buy anything new. When I say new, I mean Llanrwst books that I hadn't seen before. But I managed to buy this Seryddiaeth, or astronomy, in Llandudno a couple of years ago. I had to pay £70 for it. It's a hefty book by a well-known family who were involved in almanacs and of course it's not astronomy at all, it's astrology, and it has the most extraordinary diagrams inside, setting out the movements of the planets as they influence our lives and all that kind of stuff. It's a load of farrago, in my opinion, of course, but I was delighted to be able to buy a book that I hadn't seen before from John Jones Press. I've spent years trying to assemble a bibliography of his work, everything that printed in Trefriw and Llanrwst by the family. I know there are others that I haven't been able to get hold of, but I haven't. This is the first new Llanrwst publication I've been able to buy in 25 years. All the rest that you see, I've bought earlier than that. This is a rare publication which was printed and published by John Jones. And this is the story of the life of Thomas Williams Capelillo. Now, he was the man I mentioned as the book salesman, but he's an interesting character. And I was delighted that when I was able to edit this book and produce a modern edition of it, which Gwasg Myrddin Ap Dafydd published years ago, there was a week in the early 1980s when the school, everything was closed. Snow was yards deep on the ground. And I was living out in Abermagwr in a little old farmhouse with my family. And all I could do was to get on with something. And what I did was to type out this booklet. And when the snow melted, I took the story to Fergus Johnston, the retired professor of history in Aberystwyth, whom one or two of you may remember. And he, of all people, who was as English and as military of his demeanor as he came, and who had a fabulous library in his house full of books about the adventures of the halberdiers in Ethiopia and goodness knows what. He was able to tell me about Capelillo's adventures with the army in the early 19th century when the British took possession of Buenos Aires. I had no idea until I read this little book that the British Army had been in Buenos Aires. And it was from there that Thomas Williams sailed to South Africa and was lashed on his way for dropping his rifle over the edge of the boat. I don't know how he managed to do that. It's pretty careless, but there we are. He suffered for it. He became, or probably was before he left the army, an alcoholic, but eventually he got religion and it saved him. And John Jones's sons got him to tell his story. They wrote it down and their father published it so that the old boy could sell it to keep him from the workhouse, where, of course, eventually he died. John also was willing to print publications, periodicals for people. This is the Traveller for the Sunday schools. Daisies, Pilgrim, I'm not happy about that. Number 1, I think, is probably the only number published. On the other hand, when you come to Athro Plentyn, the child's teacher, a prize for the scholars in the Sunday school, which the Sunday schools would pay a penny a copy for and distribute to the children. And this periodical ran for many years. John Jones took it over from a previous printer and eventually handed it on to somebody else. And this is typical of a woodcut, which also appears on his ballads when he couldn't think of anything else to put. More interesting in some ways was this publication, although it's the only number, as far as I know, that was ever published. And this is the shield of freedom, or the turning oppression upside down. Number 1, 1839. But again, I think this Owen Williams, I believe, was the publisher. John Jones, the printer, and I don't know how many copies of that still exist. Then I apologize, in my haste for assembling this, my first ever PowerPoint presentation, I put in a picture of the same book twice. I apologize for that. This is the vet's guide, the doctor for animals, so that every man can care for his own animals. And among other things, the best treatment for cattle, and all kinds of other offers. John Jones was immensely productive, it may seem to you. There's quite a range of publications. I've listed about 300 in my bibliography, and I have copies of over 150 of them. But he didn't make a great deal of money, ever. Sometimes he was quite desperate and would ask his son Ivan, if he had any work in, to send him £1 or 2 to keep the wolf from the door. Things were tough. And this is another book I've put in twice. I do apologize. This is, and this, I hadn't learned to edit photos properly this is a lovely little book. The Gwynedd Nightingale, a cascade of poems. It's a dinky little book with a lovely blue cover, which doesn't appear in this shot at all. I'm disappointed in my Huawei camera. I was told it was the best you could get when I bought it, when I rented it, but it's not. More stuff again. This, I know you can't see it probably, but this was a printing job done for the young men of the Methodist Society in Liverpool, Lla'r Pwll, as they called it. This is an extraordinary book, typical of the kind of stuff. John Jones would print things that I'm sure other people just weren't interested in doing or were frightened to do. This is the Oracle, or the Book of Fate of Bonaparte, the magician. And it's a book about conjuring with all kinds of experiments. And over here we have, he was perfectly willing to publish stuff in English. This is a very pleasant mauve cover, which doesn't show up properly. A sketch of some parts of the county of Carnarvon. I don't know who MLL was. If anybody can tell me afterwards, I'd be most grateful. All kinds of ephemera, trivia. Rhodd Mam, a famous text for nonconformist Sunday schools and children's use. A catechism, also for nonconformist use. A Ready Reckoner. Now then, I can't even read that one. Over here, we've got Myfyrdod Mewn Mynwent, which is a very popular poem based on Gray, but not translated from Gray's elegy, Meditation in the Churchyard. And this is just another of the Ready Reckoners that he published. Then we come to the end with a view of 2 of his last books. The first, Caniadau Caledrin. Caledrin, William Williams, was a poet of some repute in his time, and a man who was very interested, it's quite obvious to me, in high standards of publication. And this, to me, is as good as a jobbing printer could do in the 1850s, and John Jones by then was in his 70s. To produce such, sorry, 1856. It's not the 60s. Lovely, simple, plain cover, title page. And here, and I'm sorry that our faces are in the way, but this is a truly remarkable book. And in some ways, it's the most important book that John Jones printed. It's the work of the major 18th century poet Gronwy Owen, edited by John Jones's son, Edward, who, despite the family's nonconformity, had, with his father's blessing, become a priest. And he edited the Gronwy's poems. This was the first time that this Welsh classic had been edited, together with a collection of his letters and the story of his life, and printed by John on his own press, quite possibly using his own type, I don't know, but very much a home production. And although he did produce 1 or 2 leaflets after this book in 1860, this is really his last important book. And with that, I leave you with his image, a man for whom I have the greatest love and respect, and for all his products as well. Thank you for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi i gyd.
Thank you very much indeed. That was wonderful, very interesting, and I think for a first attempt at a PowerPoint was also very fine. One thing that struck me was the picture of the press that you showed early on.
Oh yes.
Which was a rolling press, well, a press with a roller, and that in the 18th century would have been a proofing press, and wouldn't have been for the sort of high quality material that later came from his press. Did he have a platen press?
I don't think so, no. Those are the presses that he used.
All the way through. That's, you know, surprising, but I know people did use those rolling presses for... It's
quite a hefty little machine,
yeah.
And it was hard work to use because that great big lever took some elbow grease to work. You will have to tell me how I can get out of a blank screen with only you and me, David, so that other people can...
If you go to the top and
on the green,
click on view options, and it should allow you to stop sharing.
Oh, so not new share. Stop share, remote control, annotate, pause, share, participants.
No, right at the top. It should say stop sharing.
Oh yes, here we are, stop share. That's it. Good. Oh, hello.
Hi. Could I invite everyone now to turn on their sound and a video? And does anyone else have a question or a comment, please?
A comment, I hope, but not one said. Yeah, you must. You're listening.
Oh, come on! Don't tell me you were all asleep.
No. Can I say something? Can I say something?
Yes, please.
It's not a question, it's a comment. Sorry, I'm delighted to hear that an episode of very early Argentine history is mentioned. I just couldn't believe it, that a Welshman would have been there in 1806, you know, and 1808. We declared independence in 1810, but the English tried to invade us to get at Spain, of course, in 1806 and 1808, and both times we repelled them, so they never did take Buenos Aires. So, but I was delighted to hear that it was mentioned in such a learned talk and part of the press of this gentleman. Thank you, Gerald. It was a lovely talk.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any other questions?
If you've got anything on your shelves from the Llanrwst press that you think I might be glad to see, I'd love to know about it. I'm gzm094@gmail.com.
I'm going to show my ignorance here. Why was Trefriw and Llanrwst such a centre for printing in Welsh?
Oh, I think because David Jones lived there. That was the first successful press in North Wales. David had published his books and his early ballads in Shrewsbury, but when he finally got hold of the Lewis Morris press after many years of struggle, and got it to Trefriw, where he lived, that was his natal home. That's where he was, and there we go. The advantage of Trefriw was that it's at the head of navigation on the Conway.
Oh, right. And so books would be distributed by water then?
I don't know how he distributed books, but certainly he did. There's plenty of evidence to show in his account books that he was exchanging books with one of the Merthyr Tydfil printers, so that North Wales stuff was being sold in Merthyr Tydfil, and Merthyr Tydfil stuff was being sold in Trefriw, in Llanrwst, rather.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Ian?
Well, just to mention that the book you showed, Mawl yr Arglwydd, by John Ellis, I don't know who drew the picture of John Ellis, but it's very, very unusual. It's the only book of its kind that has a portrait of the author on the not on the title page, but following the title page. The other thing about Mawl yr Arglwydd is that although the engraving was done in London, the music is the first Welsh music printed on Welsh soil.
Yes.
Everything before then had been printed in London, and there were a couple of music books printed, Welsh music books printed before Mawl yr Arglwydd. They were music primers, little grammar books, which had staves printed, but the notes handwritten.
Well.
Because the printer didn't have any music type. And John Jones was probably one of the earliest people to use music type, which, as you say, he may well have cast himself. The other thing that I thought was interesting, again following the musical theme, there were two music printers whom I've spoken about to the group, Isaac Jones and his brother Daniel Lewis Jones. Rather later, they were printing in the 1870s onwards.
You mean in Tremadog?
No, Isaac Jones was in Treherbert, and Daniel Lewis Jones was in Briton Ferry in South Wales. But the two of them had been blacksmiths. And there's this interesting association of the blacksmith's craft with printing. Now, what I've never found out is why Isaac Jones and his brother, independently of each other, both became printers, having been blacksmiths, and how they learnt the craft of printing. But it's, there's that association of hot metal, which is very interesting. I don't know whether there are more printers in Wales who had been blacksmiths. I don't know, but those are two further examples to add to John Jones.
Well, it's very interesting indeed, yes.
When can I...
Genia, please.
Make a comment. When I first went to work to the library, the National Library, there was a print shop in the library, of course, and I can recall seeing Ambrose Roberts stirring a pot of hot lead.
Really?
Can Hugh Ceiriog perhaps tell us whether Ambrose ever made any type? I can recall him stirring this pot.
Jolly dangerous stuff to stir.
Yeah.
Breathing lead fumes.
Exactly. Yes. I don't know whether Hugh would know.
Is Hugh there?
I think Hugh did join at one stage, but I don't know if he's still with us.
It says Hugh's iPad, but he's
on mute.
He's on mute. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, Hugh, speak to us. Hugh, os gwelwn ni'n dda. Byddwn ni dwlu clywed am hyn.
No.
No.
Oh dear.
I don't know whether Hugh Owen ever saw this phenomenon.
No, never, unfortunately.
No. I shall get in touch with Hugh by other means and let you know, Gerald.
Okay, I'd be very glad to know about that.
Okay.
Because if any, thinking about it, of course, the press in the library is Gwynogrin Evans's press, and Gwynogrin must surely have cast some of his own type. When you think of the printed version of the Black Book of Carmarthen, for example, where he imitates as best as possible the strange manuscript writing of that manuscript.
Can you repeat your email address, Gerald?
My email, yes. G for Gerald, Z for Zebedee or Zephaniah or whatever, M for Morgan, 094, my old soldier's number when I did national service, and then at gmail.com.
At gmail.com, okay.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, hello, Hugh.
I'm here.
Dean, would you like to repeat your question?
Hugh,
Yes.
can you remember Gerald with a pot of molten lead in the print shop in the National Library?
Ambrose,
sorry, yeah.
Yes. Ambrose, yeah.
Yes.
Not me.
They did, they had a monotype caster in the library. The original monotype caster they had come from Guggenog. And they had a more modern monotype caster when I came to the library in the 60s. And they did produce, the monotype made its own type from lead, molten lead.
Well.
So they were broken letters broken bits of type that they would put back in the pot to...
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Were single letters, not like the linotype who produced lines, but individual letters.
Yeah.
And it was only used once, and then they were put in the pots to melt again to be further used.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that, because another man who had his own press was, oh dear, what was the man who wrote the wonderful hymn, Nadwng Nawd on Gwell, helpwch fi Ryddian.
Hedydd Ial.
Eos Ial. There's a wonderful story about him. He couldn't afford to print his own, to get his poetry printed by a printer. So he built some kind of old wooden press and bought a sack full of printer's pie from a type shop in Chester. And he and his wife carried the sack home and spent the winter sorting the type so that they could print from it. And I've got a couple of those booklets. They're really extraordinary to look at, absolute treasures of the printing history in Wales. And the great difficulty about the history of printing in Wales has been wonderfully chronicled by Ivano Jones, but that book it's like struggling through a bamboo thicket, trying to get to all the wonderful facts that he conceals in the middle of all this wonderful information. Difficult to use, but essential.
Could I just ask about the Dublin almanacs? Why, by putting Dublin on the title page, do you avoid paying tax?
Well, they didn't pay tax. Dublin was exempt from, Ireland was exempt from paying tax on periodicals.
All right.
Simple as that. And so they would claim that they'd imported these things and sell them for threepence. They'd have had to charge more if they'd had to include the tax. The government didn't. The British government did its best to keep people in great ignorance. They were afraid of the press. They still are.
Gerald, were the ballads, were they commissioned for printing? It's Gwenda speaking here. Were they commissioned for printing by the people who wrote them, or did people collect them from oral history and then somebody decided to get them printed?
Oh, the Welsh ballads were not collected from oral history like the English ballads are supposed to have been, the supposed origin of the border ballads, for example. But Welsh ballads were usually, we know who the authors were. There are only 2 child ballads that were, of which there are versions in Welsh. Other ballads were authored. And of course, by the time that John Jones was printing, it seems that he preferred dealing with love songs and other popular matter which could go on selling. Whereas ballads about railway disasters or mining disasters were much more popular in South Wales, where they were hot news. But of course, they didn't last. Murder ballads, on the other hand, of course, were always popular. But these were written by Welshmen whose names we know. Iwan Meirion and Dic Dywyll and Abel Crwst, the 3 best known. Tecwyn Jones has edited their work and is immensely knowledgeable about them.
Thank you.
Sawney Bean, the cannibal, exists. I think originally it was Scottish, was it? And but yes, it certainly exists in English language versions. You mentioned.
I'm having the utmost difficulty in understanding you. I'm sorry. What with my hearing aids and the quality of the audio?
All right. I was talking. You mentioned Sawney Bean.
Yes.
The cannibal. Now there are several English accounts of that story.
All right. Yeah. Another a product of the same period is the first printed version of the story of Thomas Jones Fanon. Oh God, my memory. You know who I mean, Twm Shwn Gati. There's I've got an 8 or is it 12-page pamphlet of the story of the very first publication, but I don't know whose press it's from.
Are there any other questions? Right.